Mr. Speaker. Just to begin with, the Minister glossed over a number of areas talking about clarifying and validating. The government is clarifying that you can hold the sessions concurrently, but he glossed over the fact that, in fact, they've been doing that without that explicit authority for months and months. This is a cock-up that's being fixed up. So let's call a spade and a cock-up in this and not gloss over it. The Minister also glossed over the fact that they've validated February of last year as the closing date for submissions. Well, that's a long time ago. That was another cock-up, Mr. Speaker. And then he did acknowledge that they fixed an error in the main act about procedural requirements for the filing of appeals on questions of law with the High Court. That's a third cock-up. Now, why I raise these things, Mr. Speaker, is these mistakes have been made in the legislation that we're fixing tonight, but we're fixing this legislation at 20 minutes to midnight after sitting since 9 o'clock this morning and without the benefit of a select committee process. Is there any better way to continue stuffing up legislation than doing it in the way that the government is doing it tonight? You know, a wise government would learn from its mistakes, and this government is simply repeating its mistakes. Mr. Speaker, this is the second reading. During the second reading, normally we would rise to our feet to discuss the submissions that we have heard from members of the public and experts in the area. We would discuss the consideration that Parliamentary Counsel Office had given to the drafting and the errors that the PCO would have found in the legislation and would have corrected before reporting back to the House. And we would talk about the hours of analysis that the Select Committee had put into the legislation. None of us can do any of that tonight, sir, because that process was not followed. And the question I have to ask to the government is, when Nick Smith can announce the details of this legislation on the 16th of September, more than 2 months ago, why didn't this government get its act together and have the first reading of the bill at that time, so we could have honoured the democratic principles of this House in giving the public the right to be heard on it? I've heard members of the government and the ACT Party tonight singing the praises of a democratic process where there's the opportunity to be heard. They were talking about the hearings that this bill is legislating for, but they didn't acknowledge that they were totally contradicting themselves in supporting legislation that forbade the public, blocked the public from being able to make submissions on it. It is bad process to have urgent legislation. I accept this legislation needs to go through before Christmas. I agree with the Attorney-General that it will be a good thing if we can get these hearing processes operating effectively so that they can meet their statutory deadline and report back, and we can get a unitary plan in place that will allow for better planning process and better resource management process. I agree with that, sir, but it was not necessary to ram this thing through in the middle of the night and not allow the public to have its say. I listened with interest to the ACT member because he was damning the process that his predecessor from the ACT Party in the same electorate of Epsom had put in place and didn't see the contradiction. And then the ACT member said, we've got to have a change in unitary process so we can remove the rural-urban boundary so the city can move out. But the city can't move up. The city can't intensify. It can't become more compact. You know, I listened to the Productivity Council, Murray Sherwin and his team yesterday, and they said, why have we got a problem with availability and affordability of housing? He said, if you create a situation where the city can neither move out nor move up, there's only one thing that gives them that, and that's prices. And we have a crisis in availability and affordability because we've blocked the city from moving either out or up. and it shouldn't be an either-or, it should be a both-and. And the unitary plan will be about a more compact city, and I agree with my colleagues from the Green Party on that. And inevitably, because the population of Auckland is going to increase by 1 million in the next 30 years, it's going to have to move out as well. And I, of course, would argue that it's good to allow that city to move out, only, however, if you've got the infrastructure in place to make that happen. I was down at the Karaka Lake subdivision the other day, and I drove by Pocono. And there's huge developments there. I'm sure that you would recognise them, Mr. Speaker. But what there isn't there is any infrastructure to support those people. A huge percentage of the people in Pocono are going to be working in town, but we've got a motorway that's already clogged, and we haven't got a railway line that's sufficient to meet the needs, and we don't have a busway. So if the government is going to allow this growth to happen, and the growth will happen, then for heaven's sake, let's get a unitary plan, but not only get a unitary plan that puts infrastructure in place, get a government that is committed to ensuring that we have the infrastructure so that Auckland can grow without losing the quality of life that that city offers to its people. Because I agree with what Scott Simpson said. I thought it was very big for the member from Coromandel to acknowledge that New Zealand cannot succeed if Auckland fails. That's absolutely right, and I agree with the member. We're on the same path on that. Now, Mr. Speaker, I have to say I disagree with the point made by my friends in the Green Party that this is about taking power away from local government. Auckland Council is in favour of this, absolutely in favour of that, and including the people like Penny Holtz, who's done so much work in actually getting this unitary plan going forward. And David Kirkpatrick, the chair of the Independent Hearings Panel, is also in favour of it. If I believed that the changes being made would diminish the quality of the hearing process, I would not be recommending to my colleagues that we support them tonight. But I have seen no evidence that the changes that are being made do diminish the quality of the scrutiny of the submissions. In fact, I believe that they do allow that panel to get through its work more effectively. And Auckland desperately needs to have a proper planning process. It desperately needs a planning process that can ensure not only the development of housing and business in the urban environment, but also for the rural area and the marine environment, because the unitary plan covers all of those things. It'll be good to have a unitary plan, one plan for what is effectively one city, instead of the complexity and the fragmentation that existed, that still exists right now, actually, because of the old structure. But I want to come, lastly, to a comment that Nick Smith, the Minister in charge of this bill, made about it. He said, this bill is needed to maintain the momentum of lifting Auckland's housing supply. And he also said, this bill is needed because the legislation allowing for special housing areas is going to run out. Well, I commented on that in the first reading, the latter point, Mr. Speaker. Nick Smith has set a target of 39,000 houses. The special housing area was his big initiative to achieve that target. 39,000 houses is the goal, and Sue Moroney says, how's it going? Well, we've reached just over 100. 102, actually. Now, I haven't got my calculator here to see what 102 is as a percentage of 39,000. But it ain't much. It ain't much, and we're not going to get there. So I want to challenge the Minister in charge of this bill about this bill actually doing what he says it will do, because it is not going to hugely affect the supply of housing and the problems of availability and affordability. For 7 long years, the housing crisis has been ignored. They've ignored the impact of speculation. Only in the last few months have we had the Bright Line test. They've ignored the problem of the affordability of infrastructure for housing. They've ignored the market failure of the slowdown in building houses after the global financial crisis. They could have built houses then. They could have avoided this problem. They didn't. So my message finally, Mr. Speaker, is the unitary plan, if it's done well, will help. but it won't do it on its own. The government needs to do much more.
Order.
Mr Speaker.